Hello, RDs and RDs to be. Welcome to the RD Exam Ready podcast. My name is Zach Caseberg. I'm your tutor, coach, and guide to help you along the path of passing the RD exam. My biggest passion is to help RDs and RDs to be just like you, know how to effectively pass the CDR exam. If that sounds like you, then hey, you're in the right place. Baking itself, baking and cooking, it's like its own science experiment. It has different inputs that you can add, and you can even get different outputs at the end of baking. This is to say that if I use different types of flour, different types of sugar, different amounts of leavening, I can easily manipulate baked goods and cooking products to come up with any type of output that I may want. I may or may not want that type of output of the product that I end up with, as commonly when I bake stuff, I mess things up all the time. Baking and use of functions of ingredients is a great topic for the RD exam because what it really is incorporating is your knowledge of ingredients, of food science, how they come together in a scientific and chemical property to come up with the products that we love to eat. We haven't done really kind of every type of single ingredient that may be used in this, but what we are going to talk about is just some of the food science of how these ingredients come together, especially in the context of baked goods. So let's go ahead and let's bake up a nice little lesson here. Here's the way I would like to go about breaking down this material with you. We're going to kind of go through some of the ingredients that are commonly used in food preparation. Before that, we're going to talk through a bit of batters, doughs, and kind of touch on those a little bit, just making sure you understand different batters and doughs that you may need to know for the exam day. And lastly, we're going to finish up after our ingredients, really talking about troubleshooting of what happens when our baked goods don't end up the way we want them to, and why is this? Let's dive in. Doughs and batters. Doughs and batters are going to be just two different categories of types of baked kind of mixtures that you might see here. A dough is going to be something that's stiff or soft, two different types. That's going to be based on the liquid content of that dough. A stiff dough is something that you might imagine like pasta, a pastry, pie doughs, and some cookies. They tend to be very firm, is what you see. And that is because they have about a 1 to 4 ratio of water to flour, so much more dry compared to wet here. A soft dough is going to have a ratio more like 1 parts water to 3 parts flour, hence it being softer. In soft doughs would be things like biscuits, rolls, breads, and scones. Think of it like this a pie crust, which is going to be a firm dough, it's very firm. You can mold it into a pie tin, but bread dough is softer. You can kind of manipulate and get it out of that bowl and put it into that loaf without having to form it. Make sense? Batters are a different category here, and they're even softer than doughs. So we're going even softer here with batters. You could have a drop batter, and a drop batter has a ratio of about 1 parts water to 2 parts flour. So you can see we're getting more and more wet with each one of these. They're called drop batters because they actually can't be poured out. They're not thin enough to do that. You have to drop them in. Things like cream puffs, muffins, coffee cakes, and some cookies are like this. You maybe have seen someone spoon in some of these batters and drop them into their muffin tins, and that's what makes it kind of a drop batter. Now, a pour batter is one that's mostly liquid. It's pouring out. This is like a 1 to 1 ratio of water to flour. And this is for things that can be poured or piped out. Pancakes, popovers, shortened cakes, and waffles. These are all things that are pour batters and can be pretty easily poured out onto products. Just make sure you're familiar with what dough examples are and batter examples will be. Now, with that, what are the ingredients that are going to go into these? What do I need to bake a cake? Let's go to the store together because we're going to need ourselves some ingredients here. Let's start with flour, the big bad boy here. Flour provides much of the structure in the body of your baked goods. Certain elements of flour, specific to wheat flour, make it especially really sound for use in baking products. Mainly of which is going to be gluten. We know about gluten very well. Gluten is that protein that is found in flour that once it's hydrated and manipulated, it can be stretched, it can be kneaded, it can be incorporated into other products to trap air bubbles and help to make your products nice and chewy and that attractive structure that we like in baked goods. So gluten being in flour is a huge contributor to its why flour is so important. And flour as well, like I said, it's making up the majority of your whole baked good. So very essential. Liquid or water is quite necessary for baked goods too, because you can't just eat dry flour, you need some hydration there. Everything's going to be bone dry without some flour or water or milk of some kind. Water has that ability that it does a couple different things. Remember, water will gelatinize. So when we have a starch molecule, water is added to it, and it's able to, that starch molecule absorbs the water, it swells, and it helps to thicken up mixtures in baked goods. Liquid helps to hydrate that gluten, and it helps that gluten to then be able to be stretched, to be manipulated, to help with that chewy texture that we're looking back. Think back to Food Science of Water episode that we did kind of a few months ago, when you remember that water and liquids also act as solvents, right? Universal solvents. So they help in order to mix together components such as sugar, such as salt, such as different leavening agents. Water is helping so that all those things get well incorporated into your baked good. Now we've touched on water. Let's move over to a bit of leavening agents, and we need to spend a few minutes on leavening agents. There's three types I need you to know. Say them with me: physical leaveners, biological leaveners, and chemical leaveners. Those are just the three we need to know right there. Physical leavening is when you use air and steam in your baked goods. This happens all the time. Air and steam rises, physically help your dough products to rise, and you might not even know that. When you mix your dough, you're literally incorporating air and pockets into it. So when you put it in your mixing bowl or a KitchenAid mixer, you're moving it around, and just that process of kneading it and manipulating it is trapping air bubbles within your dough. This is causing physical leavening here. When you cream together your butter and your sugar together, this also helps to physically rise your dough because within those fat globules, we're now trapping air between those two. So, like when you do cookies, that's why you get some leavening out of your cookies there too. A great example of also how we can use leavening is use of things like physical manipulation or quickly whipping things really quick. Um, Meringues are a really great example of something that's a physical leavener. When we take egg whites and you whip them very, very quickly, what you do is you're trapping air pockets in between those protein structures. This causes leavening, and that's how those egg whites end up as these stiff peaks and end up as meringues after that time. Steam is not something we need to forget about, though. Steam is being incorporated into your baked products all the time because when you add water to your baked products and cook them, the steam rises. So this is always happening here. That steam provides that leavening process, and we see this a lot in things like popovers and cream puffs, where steam rises and it kind of pops those items out. That's what is physically happening here because that water is reaching such a high temperature and it's ending up as steam, rising products up. Next, we need to go through kind of more of our biological type of leaveners here. So, yeast and bacteria are great biological leaveners. Yeast bacteria is hydrated and fed during the rising process. So, yeast itself, what it does is it produces carbon dioxide through fermentation. When we add water and we add sugar to the yeast begins to feed off of the sugar and it produces little bubbles, is what we end up seeing. So, when it feeds off that sugar, it produces those bubbles. Those bubbles are carbon dioxide, and that's being made through fermentation. A quick note to make here, and we're going to come back to it, is salt can inhibit the action of yeast. Can be good or bad. Too much salt in your baked product, it's going to kill out your yeast and it's never going to rise up. But too little salt might make your yeast rise way too much, making it to be this very yeasty bread or excessively risen, and that can be a bad thing. So there's your biological leaveners, and now your chemical leaveners are going to be things like baking powder and baking soda. Baking soda itself isn't really a leavener. What I kind of read about in the text is to use baking soda, pure baking soda as a leavener, you have to add a lot of it to your baked goods, and that can be undesirable because then, well, everything tastes like baking soda. So baking soda by itself doesn't really do much, but it's most effective when it's combined with an acid and water. Like when you did the volcano experiment, maybe as a kid, when you take baking soda and you pour vinegar over it, what happens? Well, bubbling occurs, right? We see that expansion in that kind of thing. That's the production of carbon dioxide that's occurring. And that's the same thing that's happening when you use it in baked goods. So when I add an acid to baking soda, such as buttermilk, vinegar, or lemon juice, it's going to produce that carbon dioxide and help me leaven out my goods. Much of the time, we choose just to buy baking powder. Baking powder is going to be a mixture of baking soda and cream of tartar, which is going to be an acid. So you're already buying things already pre-mixed when you do baking powder. When we add that baking powder and hydrate it, now that acid and base are reacting together, and that's how we're getting that carbon dioxide production and the leavening of our baked goods in that case. Okay, you know about your leavening agents now. Let's keep going through some other ingredients that you need to be familiar with. What about salt? What do you like about salt in your foods? I love salt in my foods. What ways have you experienced the function of salt in your foods? For me, the first thing that comes to mind is flavor. Think back to the last chocolate chip cookie you had or a salted caramel cookie of some kind. What makes a good cookie is addition of salt because it really does bring out the richness and flavors. Salted caramel is way better than regular caramel because you have that salty kind of umami flavor. Chocolate itself comes out way more when you add salt to it. But salt also has the function of controlling things in our foods too. Specifically, we just talked about yeast a bit. In salt, it is being added to bread products just to help control that yeast production so that things don't overrise in that case. That's touched on for salt there. Now, eggs are most important and they're all about stability in your foods. What makes eggs so great is that they start out liquid and as they're cooked, they denature and they solidify. And that's what they're doing for your baked goods. Think of baking a cake. You need as much structure and as much stability as possible so that you can allow your cakes to stand up nice and tall like a building. And eggs help provide that structure. They also serve the function of adding air and leavening your products, like we talked about with meringues. When you beat even whole eggs into your baked products, there's air and they're actually expanding as they go in there. So they're helping to leaven out your products. Whether you add the whole egg or you're doing egg whites in the form of meringues, they all have their ability to cause some leavening by trapping air here. In eggs, too, they also help with color and flavor to your baked goods. Egg yolks can help provide a kind of an orangish tint to foods to make them rich, creamy from that egg yolk. And lastly, we must always come back to the fact that eggs have egg lecithin, or lecithin as you might call it. These emulsifiers are what allows your oil and your water to mix together, which is really important to have a nice cohesive product. We don't want these things separated out in your bread products. That's no good. We need that egg lecithin to help to mix those together to make everything as smooth and desirable as possible in the end. Now, we talked eggs. Let's talk oil. Let's talk fat. Fat actually can improve the volume of your cakes and your baked products. It can help with flavor, color, and it can, of course, soften and tenderize your baked goods. Fat increases the volume of baked goods because fats really help to trap air and they melt during baking, which helps to make things a lot more fluid and kind of prone to expansion. When we talked about how we can mix together the creaming of sugar and fat together, we can kind of add that to baked goods to help with that expansion. Another thing fats help with, like I said, is flavor, right? Flavor and tenderness. Think of a croissant. Croissant has tons of fat in it, It has that melt in your mouth kind of quality. And that's because things that have fat added tend to have a softer mouth feel, as well as it's going to help to make things so they're not so dry, not so stale, which can help kind of hold the shelf life of your baked goods for a little bit longer because you have a little bit more fat in there to keep that quality as high as possible. Now, sugar. Sugar helps to increase volume of baked goods. And a couple ways it does that is like we talked about with creaming with butter, is it helps to trap air within your products. So when I add it to cookies, it's helping to cause my cookies to rise a little bit. Also, it helps with rising in volume because sugar helps to feed your yeast. So the yeast has to eat the sugar, and the yeast, of course, is your leavening agent. So this makes sense as to how sugar helps with that too. Now, sugar is also known that it helps with some of the moistness because it mixes really well with water and it can have some water holding capacity in your bread products. So we can kind of see that it can help the shelf life of some bread products by adding some sugar because maybe you're going to hold on a little bit more to that water in that case too. Another thing you might see is if you bake products, you notice how your breads turn a little bit brown, right? They brown. Sugar contributes to this. If you remember back to the Maillard reaction, which is where proteins and sugars are cooked and mixed together, this causes a browning effect. This can be desirable for some baked products, and sugar is doing that exact thing when we add it to different goods. Okay. We've gone to the store. We've got our ingredients. We know what they do. What happens if there's issues with baking? A quick pause here is on the exam. This could be where questions stem from is, I had a cake that has low volume or high volume or fallen center. What is contributing to this? This can be really difficult for students. What I want you to come back to though is let's try to make sure we learn and use our critical thinking skills based on what we just talked about to see why this may occur in baked goods. You may see what I mean here. We're going to start with low volume, so my cakes did not rise. If it's underrisen, this can occur for a couple different reasons. First, explore your leavening agent. I may have had inadequate amounts of leavening agent added to my baked good, and that's why it did not rise. Or my leavening agent may have not acted correctly that causes low volume. Sugar can be a contributor to low volume in cakes and baked products. Excessive amounts of sugar can inhibit the action of yeast. Now, I know that sounds crazy because you say, well, Zach, yeast loves sugar, but we're talking way too much sugar here, so much so that it's almost drowning the yeast and the yeast can't do its job. The salt was kind of that same concept, right? Excess amounts of salt has that same effect on leavening agents as once it comes in contact with yeast, it can really inhibit that yeast production. So if I use too much salt, it may make it so that my products do not rise. We can look at other things too. Look at your liquid, look at your hydration. If I added way too much water to my products, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a really tough time with my products kind of setting here. They're not going to set very well and they're not going to rise very well either if everything's just too wet is what we're seeing there. Okay. Lastly, don't forget to look at the eggs. Eggs help provide structure and help with rising products. So you have to look at the eggs. So in that case, if I don't have enough egg in my product, I may not have enough structure or my product might not rise enough. That could be a contributor to why I would have a low volume in some of my products is they just didn't have the stability and the structure to rise up higher. Now let's go to the other side. High volume. My cakes are like huge, giant old cakes, massive, right? Well, in this case, primarily what I would look at is your leavener, and really only your leavener here. If I added like 10 times the amount of leavener to my cakes that I plan to, it would cause my cakes to rise way too much and probably isn't going to end up with a very desirable product. Another thing that could occur, is you can have a fallen center. Here's the middle of my cake here where it should sit nice and tall and straight, but it fell in the center. And this is sometimes is that sunken center, and a lot of times it's because our ingredients just didn't set together very well. And in the middle, we still might have some raw or underbaked ingredients that are making it so we can't set for a firm structure. In this case, think excess. Excess sugar can be one thing that causes a fall in center, too much hydration and holding in the middle. Excess fat, if we added way too much fat, maybe we don't have enough flour and other things to help balance it out. The excess fat can make my center way too soft and fall in. Excess leavening, like I said with the high volume, can also do this. My cake can expand too much that at some point it just kind of bubbles to the top and bursts, right? We've seen that before where a cake gets too risen, the top rises and then poof, it kind of pops and falls down, right? So that's another reason that you could see a fallen center in your cake too. Like I said, if I didn't have enough flour, this could be a potential reason that my cake just could not have that structural soundness in the middle. And if I added too much sugar, I may see that fall in the center too. That can be kind of another thing. Another thing you would look at for a fall in center, it could be that your cake was just underbaked. Now, this could be because you had a very low baking temperature, cooking time, or you're like me and you're just a little bit eager and you kept opening your oven. Because the temperature did not adequately have the ability to set the cake, it's causing this fall in center. So, really, look at that excess and kind of explore all the reasons that a fallen center can occur in a cake. We can have different cakes and different colors of cakes too, and different can be different desirability here. One thing that can cause is some cakes will be excess yellow, way too yellow, just a weird kind of yellowish tint. I like this in like yellow cakes, Texas cakes, it's pretty great. But sometimes you're like, wow, that's like really yellow and not what I wanted here. One reason for that excess yellow could be excess base or alkalinity that's causing that yellow. Because if I add too much baking soda to a product, too much base, what happens is that base can react with the anthocyanins, those white colors that are in the flour. And once those anthocyanins come in contact with too much base, they turn a yellowish color. So that's one downside of too much baking soda is you may end up with this very yellowish structure there too. What about if my cake is very brown, like way too brown in this case? What could that be? Well, I would look at my sugar content for one, because I know that sugar contributes to the Maillard reaction. So if I add way too much sugar, what happens is my cake or my baked good becomes way too brown out of way too much Maillard reaction. Another thing you should explore, was your oven way too hot? Did you bake your product way too long? Well, that of course makes sense as to why you would end up with way too brown, so much browning of your products or even burning that you might see. We see this with toast and things all the time if you just overcook it there. So, yellow can occur as a result of too much base or baking soda, and browning could be too much Maillard reaction or too much baking. Now, texture wise, we want our cakes to be nice and smooth, nice crumbly texture here, but sometimes we might end up with dry or tough cakes here. A dry cake can be caused by a couple different things. One, if you add way too much dry ingredients or dry goods, you're going to end up with a tough cake. So if you add too much flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt, you're going to have a dry cake because you just don't have enough hydration to balance out those dry ingredients. This can also lead to grittiness in your taste. Sometimes this can be good for like cookies. I kind of like that grittiness that I feel between my teeth from the sugar, but really, you don't want your cakes to taste sugary. You want it to be soft. You don't want coarse textures here. Excess eggs can also make a really tough texture. It can make things dry and rubbery. And sugar is similar to flour, can also make a texture very tough and dry. One other point I want to make here too is remember salt has that relationship with yeast where it can really kind of make yeast inactive. If I, for instance, added way too much salt, well, then my baked good doesn't rise very high and it kind of stays a little short and dense. It ends up very dense if it doesn't rise. So, this is to say that the salt that comes in contact with the yeast could prevent my baked product from rising enough. And this can make very, very dense baked products that can be undesirable too. Another thing that can happen here, too little liquid. Of course, if I don't add enough hydration, well, that's going to be a reason that my cakes are going to be dry. Or if I add too little fat, I'm not going to have enough of that tenderness that I'm looking for in my baked goods. So things will end up dry, coarse, maybe a little underrisen too. Our last thing that we might see is called tunneling. And I want to explain tunneling to you. Tunneling is when you look at the top of a cake and you see these large like divots, like someone took their finger and just push it into the top of the cake as deep as it goes. They're these large visible air pockets that form in your baked goods, and these aren't good. Tunneling can happen when gluten develops too much in certain areas. This is a result of undermixing foods. If your flour and gluten isn't fully incorporated into the full product, then you're going to have areas where gluten is developing a lot and expanding in that cake. But it's not going to help the whole product where we want the whole product to rise. It's only very kind of causing these pockets in one area. So this is not a very desirable outcome to see in our baked goods. Now, let's apply what we learned today to our practice questions. As we go through each practice question, remember, we are to use process of elimination or PO to help us to put us in the best position to get this question right. Let's start out with number one, nice and easy to warm up here. Number one, excess leavening will produce blank in a baked product. A, high volume. B, low volume. C, smooth texture. Or D, moistness. Once again, number one, excessive leavening will produce blank in a baked product. Would that be A, high volume, B, low volume, C, smooth texture, or D, moistness? So I'm going to write A, B, C, and D on my sheet like I would for exam day, and I'm going to cross out the ones I don't like, put a check mark by the ones I do like. Starting with A, high volume. I think high volume could be a good answer for this one, okay? Because high volume could be a result of excess leavening because we know too much leavening can make too much high volume. I think this could be a good one that I want to put a check mark on to hold on to. B, low volume. I don't think low volume would occur with excess leavening because excess leavening should cause high volume, right? So I would get rid of B. I don't think this is a good fit. C, smooth texture. I'm a little bit questionable on smooth texture. I don't think excess leavening would cause unsmooth texture or the other way around. I'd put just a little question mark by that one now. And then D, moistness. For moistness, I don't know if that would be the biggest thing I would see with excess leavening. I think if I was stuck between A, high volume, and D, moistness, I'm going to go with my best answer here, which is that I know excess leavening will produce a high volume in my baked goods. So we will go with answer A for number one here. Number two, pour doughs, P-O-U-R, pour doughs are primarily used to make what? A, pasta, pie, and pastries. B, biscuits, yeast bread, and rolls. C, popovers, waffles, and pancakes. Or D, muffins, cream puffs, and coffee cakes. So remember, pour doughs are poured out. So let's remember that as we look at these here. Which of these are going to be pour doughs? All right, so A, pasta, pie, and pastries. Were those pour doughs? I don't think though. So I think they were more like stiff doughs, more firm doughs is what I remember from those. A is just going to be out for me because these are like the firmest of the firm. B, biscuits, yeast bread, and rolls. Biscuits, yeast bread, and rolls. Okay, I'm going to hold on to that one. C, popovers, waffles, and pancakes. What's that one going to be? Those can be poured out, is what we can see for those ones there. So those kind of the pour batter that we're kind of thinking of, we're looking for what a pour batter could be. I think that's going to be a good answer for that one right there for us. For C, muffins, cream puffs, and coffee cakes. These ones were more like drop batters. That's what we saw in this one. Muffins, cream puffs, and coffee cakes. Those were more of the drop batters there. I'm gonna get rid of C in that case. Okay, good. Let's start this question one more time here. I'm just gonna reword this for you here. So pour batters. Pour batters are primarily used to make A, pasta pie and pastries. It's not A because we know they're not being poured out. Biscuits, yeast bread, and rolls. Pour batters, pour batters. Well, those aren't going to be pour batters either. I think they're going to be soft doughs. C, popovers, waffles, and pancakes. I like this one actually because waffles, I remember I've poured waffles for batter before. That seems like a good example for a pour batter. So I'm going to hold on to C. And then D, muffins, cream puffs, and coffee cakes. Well, muffins, cream puffs, and coffee cakes, to me, those are actually going to be a good example of more of like those firmer batters that we kind of saw there, right? More of like those drop batters is what we're going to see for that one. So if I were going to go with my best answer of pour batters are primarily used to make, I'm going to go with answer C. Popovers, waffles, and pancakes as my best answer there. Number 3. A baker produces a cake that is excessively yellow. This is a result of A, too much salt and sugar in the batter, B, too little baking soda in batter, C, too much baking soda in batter, or D, too little fat in batter. A baker produces a cake that is excessively yellow. This is a result of, let's go through each. For A, too much salt and sugar in batter. I don't think this is going to be known to actually cause yellowish tints inside things. Salt and sugar, they have lots of things they can do with different doughs, but I don't think causing yellowness is going to be our issue. I'm going to rule out answer A. For B, too little baking soda in batter. I'm going to get rid of B. I don't think it's a good fit. C, too much baking soda in batter. I like this as an answer because I know that some of those anthocyanthins, those white colors that are present in flour, those can come into contact with a base. And in cases where there's excess base, what happens is they turn a very yellow color. I think C is going to be a great fit for me. And D, too little fat in batter. Well, I know fat can help with the color. Too little, I don't think too little would cause too much yellowing. That doesn't seem like a good fit. So a baker produces a cake that is excessively yellow. This will be a result of C, too much baking soda in the batter. That's a wrap for today's lesson, students. I hope you watched, listened, and learned during today's show. Remember that passing this exam is a journey. We all need assistance along the way. So please do yourself and me a favor. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching and listening. If you haven't, please tell other students who are studying because I love to reach as many students as possible. Rate, review, comment, and help spread the word. And always remember, to my RDs to be, happy studying to you.